There's a particular kind of company that becomes so dominant, so completely synonymous with its category, that people forget it was ever an underdog at all. Nike is that company. For a generation of consumers, Nike didn't just sell shoes. It sold the very idea of athletic ambition. The swoosh became shorthand for greatness. But somewhere between building the biggest sneaker empire on earth and stumbling to the 2020s, Nike forgot how it got there in the first place. This is the story of how a company built on rebellion became the establishment it once fought against, and how that shift quietly hollowed out the thing that made it great. To understand how Nike lost its way, you first have to understand how it found its way. In the late 1960s, a young accountant named Phil Knight and his old college track coach, Bill Bowerman, were running a scrappy little operation out of the trunk of a car, importing Japanese running shoes, and reselling them to anyone who would listen. They weren't the biggest player in the room. They weren't even close. What they had instead was obsession, a genuine, almost irrational belief that better shoes could be built by people who actually understood what it felt like to run in pain, to chase a personal record, to lose a race by half a second. That obsession became the company's entire operating philosophy long after it stopped being a garage operation. Nike's early identity wasn't built in a boardroom. It was built on a track in Eugene, Oregon, through a runner named Steve Prefontaine. Pre wasn't just fast. He was reckless, magnetic, and utterly unwilling to run a race the safe way. He talked trash. He ran from the front. He lost sometimes because he refused to play conservatively, and audiences loved him for it. When Nike aligned itself with Prefontaine, it wasn't just signing an athlete. It was borrowing his personality and stitching it into the brand's DNA. Nike became the company that didn't play it safe either. It took risks on unproven technology, on unproven athletes, on entire categories of footwear that didn't exist yet. That instinct is what led Nike, more than a decade later, to make one of the boldest bets in sports marketing history. A not-yet superstar guard out of North Carolina named Michael Jordan. Nike wasn't the favorite to land him. It didn't have the basketball pedigree of Converse or Adidas. What it had was audacity, the willingness to build an entire shoe line around one unproven player, and let him wear in defiance of league rules about shoe color, generating exactly the kind of controversy that turned a product into a cultural phenomenon. The gamble paid off almost immediately, and the Jordan brand would go on to become one of the most valuable pieces of intellectual property in the history of sports. But the deeper lesson wasn't really about basketball. It was about pattern recognition. Find the athlete, find a movement, and get there before your competitors even realize a movement is happening. Nike ran this playbook again and again, with Tiger Woods in golf, with Serena Williams and Ronaldo, always positioning itself just ahead of the culture rather than reacting to it. For decades, that formula worked because Nike stayed hungry. It kept behaving like a challenger even as it became the biggest company in its industry. But somewhere along the way, being the biggest started to matter more than being the boldest. The shift wasn't a single decision. It was a slow accumulation of smaller ones, each individually reasonable, that together pulled the company away from the instincts that built it. The first real crack came from leadership. For most of its history, Nike had been run by people who came up to the company, who understood its culture and its bets on gut instinct over spreadsheets. When outside executives eventually took the wheel, they brought a different philosophy, one oriented around near-term efficiency, direct-to-consumer sales targets, and data-driven decision-making rather than the intuitive, athlete-first risk-taking that had defined the brand for decades. On paper, this looked like modernization. In practice, it meant Nike started optimizing the machine it already had instead of building the next one. Retail partnerships that had taken decades to build were deprioritized in favor of app-based sales. Shelf space at specialty running stores, the exact kind of stores where serious athletes discover new shoes and new brands, was seeded, sometimes willingly, in pursuit of higher margins online. It seemed to work for a while, boosted by a pandemic that pushed everyone into digital shopping anyway. But when in-person retail came roaring back, Nike had already relinquished the relationships and physical presence that once made it inescapable. Meanwhile, a wave of smaller, hungrier brands did to Nike exactly what Nike had once done to its own predecessors. Companies like Hoka, On, and New Balance didn't try to outmarket Nike. They simply built better products for specific, underserved runners and let word of mouth do the rest. Hoka built maximalist cushioning for people who wanted comfort on long runs and long shifts on their feet. On build a distinctive, unmistakable silhouette around a genuinely novel cushioning idea born, almost poetically, from an athlete who couldn't find a shoe that solved his own problem, not unlike Bowerman pouring rubber into a waffle iron decades earlier. These brands weren't chasing Nike's playbook. They were running an updated version of the exact playbook Nike had abandoned. Solve a real problem for a real athlete, let authenticity build a brand, and worry about scale later. It's telling that specialty running stores, the retail channel closest to serious runners, became dominated by brands other than Nike, even as Nike still held a commanding share of the broader athletic footwear market. Market share is a snapshot, momentum is a trend line, and the trend line had turned against the company that once set the pace. Nike's struggles weren't purely strategic, either. They were also reputational. A company whose entire identity rests on trust, integrity, and the mythology of hard-won greatness is uniquely vulnerable to scandal, and Nike endured a string of them. High-profile personal controversies involving marquee athletes forced the company into a defensive, image management posture for years at a time. A doping scandal that touched its own elite distance running program, a program built specifically to reclaim American dominance in the sport, undercut the very narrative of clean, hard-earned achievement that Nike had spent decades selling. Internal cultural issues, including allegations of a toxic and inequitable workplace, further damage a brand that had always sold itself as being on the right side of ambition and fairness. None of these scandals alone would have been fatal to a company as large as Nike, but cumulatively, they consumed years of leadership attention and corporate goodwill that might otherwise have gone toward innovation, at precisely the moment competitors were sprinting ahead. Perhaps the most painful irony in Nike's recent history is how often the company saw the future clearly and simply failed to commit to it. Nike didn't miss the outdoor and trail running boom because it lacked vision. It had actually pioneered trail footwear technology decades earlier and built an outdoor sub-brand well ahead of most competitors. But that division was allowed to wither for years while attention and investment flowed toward the company's biggest, safest bets: classic basketball silhouettes, retro releases, and a reliable cash flow of the Jordan line. Betting on nostalgia is a very different instinct than betting on Prefontaine or Jordan once was. Nostalgia doesn't require risk. It doesn't require imagination. It just requires reprinting what already worked. And for a company whose entire identity had been built on being first, being ahead, and being a little reckless, leaning on nostalgia was its own quiet admission of decline. The financial consequences eventually became impossible to spin. Nike weathered its steepest single-day stock decline in years as investors reacted to weakening guidance, and it posted one of its sharpest annual revenue drops in its history as a public company. These weren't abstract numbers on a balance sheet. They were the market's blunt verdict on a decade of strategic drift. A company that once defined an entire category had become a follower in several of its own foundational categories: running, basketball culture, and eventually even the broader outdoor and lifestyle spaces it had once been early to. What makes Nike's story genuinely interesting, though, isn't just the decline, it's the attempted correction. Recent leadership has explicitly tried to walk back many of the decisions that hollowed the brand out, rebuilding wholesale relationships, reinvesting in the specialty running channel it had abandoned, relaunching the outdoor line it once pioneered and then neglected. None of this is glamorous. It's not a bold new athlete signing or a rule-breaking shoe launch. It's closer to a company relearning humility, going back to retailers it once treated as optional, rebuilding trust with athletes it once took for granted, and try to remember that innovation isn't something you can simply purchase back through marketing budgets once you've stopped doing it. There's a broader lesson buried in Nike's story, one that applies well beyond sneakers. Companies rarely collapse because they run out of resources. Nike never lacked capital, talent, or brand recognition. What it lost was a way of thinking, the willingness to bet on something unproven, to risk failure in pursuit of being first, to treat comfort as the enemy rather than the goal. Every disruptor eventually faces the same fork in the road. Keep behaving like an underdog even after winning, or start protecting what you've already built at the expense of what you might build next. Nike chose protection for the better part of 2 decades, and its competitors made it pay for that choice. Whether Nike fully recovers its old identity remains an open question. Culture, unlike a balance sheet, doesn't repair itself on a fixed timeline. Consumer trust takes far longer to rebuild than it takes to lose, and the running and outdoor markets that Nike-seeded competitors are now populated by brands with their own loyal followings and their own creation myths. Myths that, ironically, sound a lot like the one Nike used to tell about itself. If there's a path back for Nike, it likely doesn't run through another retro drop or another nostalgic anniversary release. It runs to the same uncomfortable place the company started, taking real risks on real problems for athletes willing to test something unproven without knowing for certain whether it will work. That was always the real secret behind Nike's rise. Not the swoosh, not the slogan, not even the athletes themselves, but a willingness to move first and stay uncomfortable. Somewhere in its climb to becoming the biggest name in sports, Nike mistook comfort for success. The company that taught the world to just do it spent the better part of 2 decades doing almost nothing new, coasting on the momentum of decisions made in a very different era. Its slow unraveling wasn't the result of one bad year or one bad executive. It was a predictable outcome of an underdog forgetting what it felt like to actually be one. Whether Nike can rediscover that feeling, rather than simply market the memory of it, will determine if this becomes a genuine comeback story or just another chapter in a long history of dominant companies that stopped moving and got passed by the ones that never stopped running.